Corrupt sheriff auctioned a widow's child. Until the dead man walked back into town, they buried Thomas Chen with his own hands still dirty from the mine that killed him. But when his 7-year-old son was sold like cattle at a public auction, a dead man's twin brother rode into town, carrying 6 months of rage and a promise written in blood. The auction block stood in Millbrook's dusty square like a wooden altar, stained dark with the sweat and tears of the desperate. Sarah Chun clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders as Sheriff Dalton's voice boomed across the gathered crowd, each word falling like stones into her chest. Outstanding debts on the Chun mining claim total $847, Dalton announced, his badge catching the harsh afternoon sun. Property and persons to be auctioned for settlement. Sarah's hands trembled. $847. Her husband Thomas had been dead 6 months, buried after the mine collapse that took 3 good men and left their families with nothing but grief and debt. She tried to work the claim herself, her small hands bleeding as she hauled rock and sifted dirt, but a Chinese widow had no rights in Millbrook. No voice. No protection. Mama. 7-year-old Billy pressed against her side, his dark eyes wide with confusion. He didn't understand why men were looking at him like he was a horse to be sold. Sarah smoothed his black hair, her heart breaking with each gentle stroke. "Stay close to me, little dragon," she whispered in Cantonese, using the pet name Thomas had given their son. The crowd shifted restlessly. Miners, ranchers, and townspeople gathered like vultures, some curious, others hungry for cheap labor. In the back, old Pete the prospector stood silent, his weathered face carved with anger. He'd been Thomas's friend, one of the few white men who'd treated the Chun family with respect. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, his belly straining against his vest. First item, household goods and personal effects. Sarah watched helplessly as her life was dismantled piece by piece. Thomas's mining tools went for $12. Her wedding dress, carefully preserved in cedar, sold for $3. The carved wooden horse Thomas had made for Billy's 5th birthday disappeared into a stranger's pocket for 50 cents. With each sale, Sheriff Dalton's eyes grew brighter. Sarah knew the truth that no one dared speak aloud. Thomas's death had been no accident. The mine support beams had been weakened, the tunnels flooded deliberately. Dalton wanted the Chun claim for himself, and a dead Chinaman couldn't fight back. Now, then, Dalton's voice cut through her memories like a blade. The boy, 7 years old, healthy, good for farm work or apprenticeship. Bidding starts at $50. The world tilted beneath Sarah's feet. She'd known this moment would come, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like drowning. Billy's small hand found hers, his fingers ice-cold despite the desert heat. 60, called out Jeremiah Hawks, who ran cattle outside town. His ranch was known for working men until they dropped. 75, this from Martha Crowley, whose husband had died the winter before. She needed help with her general store, but Sarah had heard whispers about how she treated the Mexican children who worked for her. Billy began to cry, quiet tears that broke Sarah's heart into smaller and smaller pieces. She wanted to scream, to fight, to claw at these people who saw her son as property. But she was one small woman in a town that had already decided her fate. $100. The voice came from the back of the crowd, cold and final. Sarah turned to see a man in a black coat and string tie. Samuel Morrison, who owned the biggest mine in the territory. She'd heard stories about his operation. Children who went and never came out the same. Some never came out at all. Going once, Sheriff Dalton called, his gavel raised. Going twice, stop this. Sarah found her voice at last, stepping forward with desperate courage. Please, I can work. I can pay the debts. Give me time. Time's up, woman, Dalton sneered. Should have thought of that before you let your husband get himself killed. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder. 2 deputies moved forward to take Billy, but the boy clung to his mother's skirts with the fierce grip of the drowning. Sarah dropped to her knees, holding him close, breathing in his scent of soap and little boy's sweetness one last time. Be strong, little dragon, she whispered. Remember who you are. Remember your father loved you. As they pulled Billy away, his cries echoing across the square, Sarah felt something die inside her chest. But in that death, something else was born, a cold, patient fury that would burn until justice was served. Old Pete caught her eye from across the crowd, his face grim with shared rage. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect for her grief. Then his eyes shifted to something beyond her, and Sarah saw his weathered features transform with shock, his mouth falling open as if he'd seen a ghost. She turned to follow his gaze, but saw only dust devils dancing on the horizon, carrying whispers that might have been promises or might have been prayers. The whole town had watched Thomas Chen die in that mine collapse 6 months ago. They'd seen his body lowered into the ground. So when a man with his face, his walk, and his voice rode into Millbrook at high noon, even the bravest souls crossed themselves and whispered prayers. The stranger appeared like a mirage at the edge of town, dust swirling around his horse's hooves as if the desert itself announced his coming. High noon painted everything in sharp lines and deeper shadows, but this rider seemed to exist between light and dark, real and impossible. Sarah Chun sat on her porch steps, empty hands folded in her lap where Billy's small fingers had been just hours before. The auction had ended, the crowd had scattered, and now silence pressed down on Millbrook like a held breath. She'd stopped crying. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. The horses' hooves rang against the packed dirt of Main Street, each step measured and deliberate. Sarah looked up, and her heart stopped beating. Thomas. The man in the saddle wore her dead husband's face like a mask of vengeance. Same strong jaw, same way of holding his left shoulder slightly higher than his right from an old injury. Same black hair, though this rider's was longer, wilder, touched with dust and distance. He rode with Thomas's quiet grace, the easy way he'd had with horses that had made him the best rider in 3 counties. But this wasn't Thomas. Couldn't be Thomas. She'd held her husband's cold hand in hers before they closed the coffin. She'd thrown dirt on the wooden box that held his broken body. She'd mourned him through 6 months of lonely nights and empty mornings. Across the street, old Pete emerged from the saloon, whiskey bottle still clutched in his gnarled fist. His eyes went wide, then narrow, then wide again. The bottle slipped from his fingers and shattered on the wooden sidewalk, amber liquid spreading like spilled blood. Sweet Jesus, Pete whispered, his voice carrying in the desert air. Thomas? Thomas Chun. The rider's head turned toward the sound, and Sarah saw his profile clearly for the first time. Her breath caught. Not Thomas. The features were harder, carved by different sorrows. The eyes held a darkness her gentle husband had never known. But the resemblance was so strong it hurt to look at him. Other townspeople began to notice. Windows opened with soft creaks. Doors slowly swung wide. Mrs. Patterson clutched her rosary. Young Jimmy Walsh crossed himself 3 times and backed into the shadows of the general store. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground without sound. That's when Sarah noticed something that made her skin crawl with superstitious dread. The harsh noon sun cast shadows from everything in the street. The hitching posts, the signs, the gathered people. Everything except the stranger. He walked toward the sheriff's office with purpose, his spurs silent on the wooden sidewalk. His coat hung loose at his sides, revealing the well-worn handle of a Colt peacemaker. This was a man who knew violence intimately. Sheriff Dalton burst through his office door, face flushed red from whiskey and the afternoon heat. He'd been counting his auction profits, no doubt. Now he stood frozen, his mouth working soundlessly like a landed fish. No, Dalton breathed. No, you're dead. I saw you die. The stranger stopped 10 feet away, close enough to kill, far enough to savor the fear in Dalton's eyes. When he spoke, his voice was Thomas's voice, but colder, emptied of warmth. Dead men tell no tales, he said quietly, but they remember everything. The street had filled with onlookers, drawn by whispers and wild rumors. Sarah found herself moving closer, pulled by forces she couldn't name. This man wore her husband's face, carried his voice, but moved like death itself. "Where's my boy?" the stranger asked, and Sarah's heart lurched. The words came out soft as prayer, hard as granite. Dalton's hand drifted toward his gun, but stopped when the stranger tilted his head slightly. The gesture was so perfectly Thomas that Sarah nearly cried out. "I don't know what trick this is," Dalton stammered, "but Thomas Chen is dead and buried. I got witnesses. I got proof. Do you?" The stranger's voice carried the whisper of desert wind through empty graves. "Or do you just have a coffin full of rocks and lies?" Pete stepped forward, squinting hard at the stranger's face. Recognition dawned in his weathered features, followed by something like wonder. "Marcus," Pete breathed. "Marcus Chen." The name hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. Marcus, Thomas's twin brother, who'd left California years before she'd married Thomas. Thomas had spoken of him rarely and always with pain. They'd fought, she remembered. Something about a woman, about choices made and promises broken. The stranger, Marcus, never took his eyes off Sheriff Dalton. "My brother wrote to me before he died," Marcus said, each word precise as a blade. "Told me about a sheriff who wanted his claim, about accidents that weren't accidents, about promises to protect his family." Dalton's face went pale beneath its flush. "You can't prove nothing." Marcus smiled, and it was nothing like Thomas's gentle expressions. This smile belonged to winter nights and shallow graves. "Can I?" The question hung in the desert air like smoke, heavy with unspoken threats and long-delayed justice. Sarah felt hope stir in her chest for the first time since the gavel had fallen, fragile as a newborn bird. Marcus Chen had come home to a town that thought him dead, wearing vengeance like his brother's face, and Sheriff Dalton's empire of lies was about to crumble into dust. The truth came out with the thunder of gunfire and the taste of blood on desert wind. Sheriff Dalton had killed one Chen brother for his mining claim, but he'd forgotten that some men have twins and some debts can only be paid in lead injustice. The confrontation erupted like a desert storm, swift, merciless, and long overdue. Marcus Chen stood in the middle of Main Street, his brother's face carved with 6 months of rage and grief. Sheriff Dalton backed toward his office, hand hovering over his gun like a man afraid to touch fire. "You want proof," Marcus called out, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathered crowd. "Let's start with the mine collapse that killed my brother." From his coat, he pulled a folded paper, yellowed with age and travel. "Thomas wrote me 3 letters before he died. Want to hear what he said about the mysterious accidents plaguing Chinese miners? About support beams that were cut, not broken." Dalton's face flushed red, then drained white. That's lies. Chinamen always blame others for their troubles." The slur hit the crowd like a slap. Even in Millbrook, where prejudice ran as deep as well water, there were lines decent men didn't cross in daylight. Several townspeople shifted uncomfortably. Old Pete spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Thomas Chen was the most honest man I ever knew, Dalton. If he wrote it, it happened." Marcus unfolded the letter, his hands steady as stone. "February 15th, 1877. Dear brother," he read aloud. "Sheriff Dalton came by again today, wanting to buy the claim. When I refused, he said accidents happen to stubborn men. The Jenkins mine flooded last week after their foreman refused his offer. Strange how these accidents always happen to claims Dalton wants." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Jenkins mine flooding had been called an act of God, but people remembered. They remembered a lot of things when the light finally shone on them. "That don't prove nothing," Dalton blustered, but his voice cracked like a boy's. Marcus folded the letter carefully, tucked it away. "Then let's talk about Billy Chen. My nephew. 7 years old, sold like livestock this morning." Sarah stepped forward from the crowd, her small voice finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "Tell them about the debt. Marcus. Tell them how it grew." Marcus nodded grimly. "Thomas wrote that too. How a mining claim worth $1,500 somehow carried debts of $847. Funny how those debts kept growing after he died. When a widow couldn't read the English papers, you kept changing." The crowd's murmur turned ugly. Even men who'd bid on Billy Chun began to look ashamed. This was frontier justice beginning to stir, slow but inevitable as sunrise. Sheriff Dalton's hand moved toward his gun. "You're talking treason, boy." "Accusing a lawman, I'm not accusing," Marcus said quietly. "I am stating facts. And here's another fact. There's a witness to what really happened in that mine." From the crowd stepped a figure most hadn't noticed before. Tall, thin, covered in dust, and wearing miner's clothes. Sarah gasped. It was Liu Wei, one of the men who'd supposedly died in the collapse alongside Thomas. "Hello, Sheriff," Liu Wei said in accented English. "Surprised to see me?" Dalton's face went ash-gray. You died." "The mine, I escaped through the back tunnel," Liu Wei said simply. "Saw you and your boys setting the charges. Watched you flood the main shaft. I was too scared to speak before, too afraid you'd kill me too. But when I heard about the boy," the crowd erupted. Voices raised in anger, disbelief, demand for justice. This was more than corruption now. This was murder, plain and simple. Dalton's nerve finally snapped. His hand went for his gun in a desperate draw, fast but not fast enough. Marcus moved like quicksilver, his Colt clearing leather and firing before Dalton's weapon was even half drawn. The sheriff's shot went wide, splintering wood from the saloon door. Marcus's bullet found its mark with surgical precision, through Dalton's gun hand, shattering bones and sending the weapon spinning into the dust. Dalton fell to his knees, clutching his ruined hand and screaming. "That's for Thomas," Marcus said coldly. Then he fired again, the bullet taking Dalton in the shoulder. "That's for every family you destroyed." The crowd had gone silent, watching justice being served with lead and gunpowder. No one moved to help Dalton. No one called for the doctor. Marcus walked over to the writhing sheriff, pressed the barrel of his Colt against the man's forehead. "Where's the boy?" "Morrison's mine," Dalton gasped through his pain. Took him an hour ago." Marcus pulled back the hammer with a click that sounded like doom. "If that child has been harmed, I'll come back and finish this conversation." "Please," Dalton whimpered. "I got money. I can pay. Some debts can't be paid with money," Marcus said. He looked up at the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "This man murdered my brother and tried to steal his family. In Texas, we call that a hanging offense." The crowd stirred, ugly now with the taste for frontier justice. Someone had already fetched a rope. But Marcus holstered his gun and stepped back. "I'm not an executioner," he said. "But I won't stop you if that's what this town decides." As the crowd closed in around the wounded sheriff, Marcus turned toward the jail where Billy Chun waited behind bars, his small face pressed against the window, hope finally dawning in his young eyes. Justice had come to Millbrook at last, wearing a dead man's face and carrying a living man's grief. He wasn't a ghost after all, just a brother who'd carried 6 months of guilt and a dying promise across 1,000 miles of desert. But sometimes the living must wear the faces of the dead to bring justice to those who can't rest in peace. The jail cell door swung open with a rusty creak that sounded like freedom itself. Billy Chun looked up from the corner where he'd been huddled, his small face streaked with tears, but his dark eyes blazing with the fierce spirit of his father. "Uncle Marcus?" The boy's voice was barely a whisper, afraid to hope. Marcus knelt down, his hard features softening for the first time since he'd ridden into town. "Hello, little dragon. Your mama sent me to bring you home." Billy flew into his uncle's arms with the desperate force of a child who'd thought he was lost forever. Marcus held him close, breathing in the scent of innocence and fear, feeling his heart crack and heal in the same moment. Outside, the crowd had made their decision about Sheriff Dalton. The rope swung empty now in the desert wind. Justice served frontier style. Marcus had walked away before the end, unable to watch even a corrupt man die. He'd seen enough death for 10 lifetimes. Sarah waited on the jail steps, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. When Marcus emerged carrying Billy, she broke down completely, reaching for her son with shaking fingers. "Mama." Billy cried, launching himself from his uncle's arms into hers. Sarah held her child like he was made of spun glass, whispering prayers in Cantonese and English, thanking every god she knew for bringing him back to her. Over Billy's head, her eyes met Marcus's, and she saw the grief he'd been carrying like stones in his chest. "Thomas told me about you," she said softly. "He said you were his better half, the brave one." Marcus shook his head, removing his hat to run fingers through hair that needed cutting. "I was the angry one, the one who left when things got hard. Thomas was the brave one. He stayed, built a life, loved a family." Old Pete approached, hat in hand, his weathered face creased with respect. "You did right by your brother, son. Thomas can rest easy now." "Can he?" Marcus asked, the question heavy with doubt. "I came here for vengeance, Pete. Not justice. Not to save anybody. I came here to kill the man who murdered my twin." Sarah shifted Billy to her hip, the boy's small arms wrapped tight around her neck. "But you did save us," she said simply. "Maybe that's what Thomas would have wanted. Maybe that's why you came." The crowd was dispersing now, justice served and order restored. Morrison's men had returned Billy without complaint once word spread about the sheriff's fate. No one wanted to face Marcus Chen's guns over a child who legally should never have been sold. Luwei approached, dusty and tired but alive. "I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner," he told Sarah. "I was afraid." Sarah nodded, understanding. Fear was a luxury Chinese families couldn't afford in towns like Millbrook, but sometimes it was the only thing that kept them breathing. "You spoke when it mattered," she said. That took courage. Marcus stood apart from the reunion, already planning his departure. He'd done what he came to do. Dalton was dead, the boy was safe, and Thomas's killer had faced justice. But Sarah's voice stopped him. "Where will you go now?" He turned, studying her face in the golden light of late afternoon. She was beautiful in a quiet way, with strength that ran deeper than mountain roots. Thomas had chosen well. California, maybe, or further north. "There's nothing keeping me here." "There could be," she said quietly, Billy still clinging to her like a small monkey. "A boy needs men in his life to teach him how to be strong, to show him what his father was like." The offer hung in the desert air between them, heavy with possibility and pain. Marcus looked at Billy, saw Thomas's eyes looking back at him, full of trust and innocent hope. "I'm not Thomas," Marcus said roughly. "I'm not the settling kind." Sarah smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Thomas wasn't either, until he had something worth staying for. The sun was setting over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of fire and forgiveness. In the distance, a coyote howled, and somewhere a church bell rang the hour. Life was returning to normal rhythms, as it always did after storms passed. Marcus felt the weight of his brother's letters in his coat pocket, the last words Thomas had written before dying in the dark. One line echoed in his memory. "If something happens to me, Marcus, promise you'll take care of them. They're all the good I'll leave behind in this world." He'd kept half that promise already. Maybe it was time to keep the rest. "I'm not easy to live with," he warned. "I've got ghosts, Sarah. Debts that follow me." "We all have ghosts," she replied. "But we don't have to carry them alone." Billy looked up at his uncle with eyes that held no judgment, only love. "Will you stay, Uncle Marcus? Will you teach me to ride like Papa did?" Marcus knelt down again, meeting the boy at eye level. "Would you like that, little dragon?" Billy nodded solemnly. "Papa told me you were the best rider in California. Even better than him." "Your papa was a liar," Marcus said, but he was smiling now, the first genuine smile he'd worn in 6 months. "But I guess I could stick around long enough to teach you a few things." As the three of them walked down Main Street together, widow, orphan, and the brother who'd come home to ghosts, the desert wind carried away the last echoes of gunfire and grief. Behind them, the empty jail stood as monument to justice served. Ahead lay tomorrow, uncertain but no longer hopeless. Sometimes the dead couldn't rest until the living learned to forgive themselves, their choices, and the weight of promises kept too late. In Millbrook, under a sky full of stars and possibility, Marcus Chen finally laid his brother's ghost to rest and allowed himself to believe in second chances.